Welcome to the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast, episode 1500. That is how I used to start this podcast every episode, from episode 1, I think, until probably episode 100, I believe. But this is a special episode. We are at episode 1500. It's a big feat in the podcasting world. A lot of people celebrate their 100th episode, their 200th episode, their 300th episode. We are celebrating here at Speak Up for Blue, or How to Protect the Ocean Now, for 1,500 episodes. So I'm pretty happy, pretty proud of myself, but it's also, there are a lot of people who came and helped me do this. And one of those people, is Nathan Johnson, who is here today to do an Ocean Talk Friday, which we did way back when we first started. It was a really great thing. I'm going to tell you about this story. You're going to hear from him. We're going to do an Ocean Talk Friday on today's episode, number 1500. So let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And boy, has this been a ride, quite a ride. There have been a lot of ups, a lot of downs, and a lot of help to get to 1,500. And the first people really I want to thank are you, the audience, for sticking around for so long. It's been about 10 years, almost 10 years. It's been 1,500 episodes. It's been a lot of long nights, a lot of long days, trying to be creative, trying to bring you information, trying to make sure that not only are you entertained, but you're educated on what's happening with the ocean. That's the whole point. It's to tell stories about the ocean to you, so that you can make the decisions around how you want to better protect the ocean. That's the whole point of this show. And like I mentioned in the pre-intro, I've had a lot of help. I've had a lot of help from people who have been able to get me here. It's just been quite a ride. Dr. McLean, who was my first guest, agreed to take a chance on me and be like, hey, I've got this Deep Sea News blog at the time. He did, and it was huge at the time. So he was a personal hero of mine, a personal friend of mine. And he was just like, yeah, I'll do this podcast with you. I'll do this interview. And we talked about Deep Sea News, and it was wonderful. It was such a great episode. We talked about, the Fukushima, meltdown and the radiation leaking into the ocean, which is still going on today, apparently. We'll get to that soon in another episode. But then he talked about sort of the misinformation that was going on and what they did as scientists who were speaking up for the ocean to sort of basically bust the myths that were going on, including like a very big map of the Pacific that had apparently a lot of radiation, which was wrong. It was actually sea level rise. It was just like a whole thing. It was just a really interesting episode to, Dr. Chris Parsons, who's helped spread the word about Speak Up for Blue and How to Protect the Ocean, which if you didn't know, if you haven't been listening to this podcast before January of 2023, it used to be called Speak Up for the Ocean Blue, but before that, it used to be called Speak Up for Blue, hence my introduction in the beginning. And then also Dr. Ed Hindozan, who's been who was a huge help, who brought me or who kind of encouraged me to go to Newfoundland at the International Marine Conservation Congress to be able to say, hey, you can interview all these people. I have all these people to interview for your podcast. I really love it. I think this is a great thing, and we need more people to do these interviews. And he introduced me to a lot of people, including having me work on the IMCC, International Marine Conservation Congress, in Malaysia in the fundraising aspect, and that was a lot of fun. And we just it just introduced me to so many people and allowed me to be able to get so many really great episodes. He introduced me to a ton of people through that conference, and as well as other people. It was just wonderful. And Allison Besh, who works for Duke, she's definitely helped me put the podcast on the map. I worked with her on some courses for the Duke development program, the online development program for communications. We did podcast courses. We did digital storytelling courses. We just did a number of different courses, and that was just so much fun. I got to meet a lot of the different students there, and just the podcast has been able to bring me so much joy, not only in doing it, but also in meeting the people that I've been able to interview over this time. But, a big thanks goes to our guest today, and that is Nate Johnson. Nate, and I say it in the interview that's coming up, he was responsible for a lot of the content that came out within the first 2 years of Speak Up for Blue, of the podcast. And when I first met him, he reached out to me through an email and said, hey, would you be interested in having someone, I would like to write blogs. I want to write more. I love what you're doing and all this kind of stuff. And I was doing episodes once a week. And then all of a sudden I was like, hey, you know what? I will do more episodes. I've been wanting to do this for a while, do some solo episodes instead of doing interview episodes once a week. And so I increased it to 5 days a week, including the interview. And I want to include Nate because we were talking so much and we were talking about the different stories that were out there. At one point I was just like, hey, Nate, we should do this as an episode. Just grab a bunch of stories, talk about them, give our opinions on them, and have a good time. And we did that for 2 years, and it was great. Eventually he got busy and he had to do other things, but he did all this voluntarily. And that's a huge thing. It takes a lot of time for what he was doing, writing the blog post, summarizing the show notes essentially on our blog for each episode of the 5 episodes that we put out every week. And then he would also curate a lot of the articles and then summarize all the articles. And he did a fantastic job. He was just an amazing person. We ended up working for Oceana after we did Ocean Talk Friday, and then he now works for Earth Justice. And I asked him to be on this episode a little bit last minute because I'm not very organized, but I asked him to do it a little bit last minute, and he agreed right away. He was on vacation with his family in South Carolina, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll do it, no problem. I would love to be on the episode." And so we created this, I guess, interview Ocean Talk Friday. Which was super fun. Definitely brought us back to 9.5 years ago, and it's been a joy ever since. So, I am excited to bring you this Ocean Talk Friday. We did cover 3 different stories. We talked a little bit about sort of our past and how we got together, so it'll be a little bit of repetition. But after that, we talked about 3 different stories. One story looking at Pacific corals and how the remote Pacific coral reefs have been able to find a way to increase their tolerance to heat in certain ones. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about a bit of a controversial subject matter in terms of windmills and their impact on sea life, and just sort of the sort of why we need windmills and why we need wind energy and the impacts on the environment and what outweighs what's the priority and so forth. And then finally, we talk about activism, which I talked about earlier in the podcast and a couple episodes ago. And I also talked about the oil and gas industry and the movement against it. So activism plays a big role. There's some insane stories coming out where there have been some interesting protest choices of places, including an F1 race and being in the F1 race, being on the tarmac protesting and sitting on the tarmac as a protest, which is extremely dangerous. And then there's other places where, you're looking at Burning Man festival or a Burning Man retreat, whatever it is. We saw a truck, a ranger, a police person go right through the barricade to get people to stop protesting. So, and allow people to go through in the desert when they're running out of water and running out of oil. Or running out of gas. Just interesting stuff. This is what we used to talk about all the time. These types of articles that we wanted to talk about, and I'm excited to bring this Ocean Talk to you for our 100th episode. And who better to do it than Nate Johnson himself, who helped me through so many before. So super excited to bring you this. Very excited that you get to hear and you've been with me for this long. And if you've just started, welcome. and thank you so much for joining us. But here is the Ocean Talk Friday with Nathan Johnson. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Nathan Johnson, welcome back to an Ocean Talk Friday. It is episode 1500, and I couldn't imagine celebrating with anyone else but you. Nate, how you doing? Are you ready to talk about the ocean? I'm
doing great. I'm always ready to talk about the ocean, Andrew. I mean, first of all, we were talking about this before the call. 1500 is incredible. I mean, I'm happy to be here, but I feel like you're the star of this one, hitting that 1500 mark. So congratulations. I myself feel nervous. I imagine this is what actors who take a break from the movies and then come back years later feel like. It is. I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm sure we'll get back into a routine pretty soon.
Absolutely, man. It's gonna be a lot of fun. I've been looking forward to this for a while. As we were saying before we recorded, just the other week I was looking at the episode numbers, and I don't mention the episode. I used to mention the episode numbers every show, if you remember, and I was like, this time I haven't mentioned that in there's just too many episodes to mention every episode, and so I was looking at the episode numbers that I keep track of after, and I was like, at 1497, I'm like, next week will be 1500. I'm like, I got to do something special. And then I thought about it, and a picture of yours came up on my Instagram feed. I'm like, oh, Nate, Ocean Talk Friday. We got to do an Ocean Talk Friday. So for those of you who haven't followed us since the beginning, Nate was sort of like an early contributor to the podcast. I think I'd recorded maybe 10 or 11 episodes, maybe 12 episodes. Nate, you reached out to me and just been like, hey man, I've been listening to your podcast. I'm getting into writing. I would love to help and write some blog posts for you, maybe summarize some of the episodes and stuff. And I was like, this is great. And then when I saw your email, like, I've been thinking about doing, at that point I was doing one episode a week, and it was an interview style episode. And then as soon as I heard you could reach out, I'd already been thinking about increasing the number of episodes. And I was like, oh yeah, we're going to increase. And I think we went 5 days a week. Didn't we? Like right off the bat, I think we went to 5 days a week, and you were helping, and you were writing those summaries and everything, and we were working well. And then we did Ocean Talk Friday to have you on the podcast, and we did that for how long? It was like a year and a half.
It might have been a little bit longer. It was a long time.
It was a long time.
Yeah. We did several episodes.
and just to give people context of what Ocean Talk is essentially we've picked about 3 articles today, and we're going to summarize them, and then we're going to kind of give our opinions on them. And so for everybody who's listening, it's always great to be able to hear your opinions as well. And so just let us know, you can hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, and you can just kind of give us a heads up and just be like, hey, love the episode or hated the episode, whatever you want to say. But if you have a certain article you wanted to comment on or had a question about, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to answer them. And I'll share that with Nate, and then we can answer them together maybe another time. But I think that's always fun to get that interaction, because people interact with us now. When we first started, not a lot of people were interacting with us on the podcast, but now people are interacting. So it's a lot of fun to be able to do that. But look, we're going to get started right now into the episode. So we have 3 articles. I'll just kind of name what we're going to be going over. The first article we're going to be talking about is Pacific corals and their tolerance to warming oceans. So that's going to be a lot of fun. That's a Manga Bay news article. We love Manga Bay news on this podcast. The second one, we're going to be talking about wind farms and their impact on sea life. There's a great article on IFL Science that is always interesting to talk about. It's a big proponent. I guess it's a bit of controversy some people have with sea life, or with wind farms and sea life and their impacts on the environment. And then of course we're going to finish it off with some protests. I talked about last episode in terms of there's a big movement on the oil and gas and fossil industry and sort of taking away our support from that. And so we're going to talk about some of the activists and some of the kind of interesting and I'm going to say quote unquote insane sort of things that have been happening with activists and sort of certain incidents and certain events. So we'll talk about that and whether it's necessary, whether it's not necessary. We'll get both of our opinions on that. And of course, we'd love to hear your opinions as well. So Nate, should we start off with some corals?
Let's do it.
I think that's all right. So I'll summarize this one. Nate will summarize the wind farm, and then we'll kind of talk together about the events. I'll explain the activist events that were in question over the last couple of days or last week or so. But in this one, Manga News, there's a great article by Elizabeth Clare Alberts on August 30th, and she wrote an article looking at coral tolerance, coral heat tolerance. And look, we know that the ocean has had a massive heat change over this past summer. And so, there's a lot of talk about bleaching everywhere. I think there's bleaching in the Keys. There's bleaching in the Atlantic, in the Bahamas, in Hawaii. I feel I've seen some bleaching happen there. And so there seems to be a lot of bleaching going on. But in Palau, in remote islands off Palau, it seems like some research suggests that coral reefs in the Pacific Islands are becoming increasingly tolerant to thermal stress. So that's been brought on by climate change. The study found that Palau's coral reefs appeared to suffer less bleaching over 3 successive marine heat waves in 1998, 2010, and 2017. So not even talking about this heat wave. This is research from before. So while the findings provide some hope for corals, one expert says that the study has some limitations in providing a clear picture of how corals respond to different heat events. And then scientists also say that the reducing carbon emissions is essential to safeguard coral reefs and to secure a planet's future. So essentially what they found was that some of the corals haven't bleached as much. And so what they're saying here is it's become increasingly tolerant to thermal stress. They know that Palau's coral reefs increased their thermal tolerance by 0.1 degrees Celsius, that's 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit for all our American friends, including Nate, each decade since the late 1980s. That's quite an increase in heat tolerance. But it's unclear if this rising heat tolerance rate will match the pace of ocean warming. So that's the danger. I should also mention the caveat that these were remote islands. So the idea here is that these have not been impacted by other human activities, pollution, coastal disturbance, fishing, and so forth. So there's probably that caveat that should be saying there. And that we should also mention that the one possibility they're mentioning is that reefs are becoming dominated by hardier coral species, while more sensitive corals are disappearing. And the second explanation could be a genetic adaptation. In other words, just by natural selection, it may favor that the genes in corals that are more likely to survive heat stress are just surviving. That's the ones that are prevailing. So it's a really interesting article, Nate. And I should mention too, I remember reading an article where they were looking at the zooplankton, not the zooplankton, the zooanthellae in corals. And they were looking at, there's like the A, B, C, D sort of strands for the zooanthellae. And one of the interesting aspects of that was they were saying that I think it was like the zooanthellae strand D was the more tolerable one to heat. And so they said the corals that harbor this D strand would be able to survive more. And it looked like there was specific corals that had almost a preference, or that the strand showed up in more. And so the prediction there was that the way we see corals, or the way that we saw corals back in the 50s, back in the 40s, would be different than the way we see corals today. And they would slowly change to a more heat tolerant strain of zooanthellae and corals that would harbor them. So I just think it's a little bit of hope in today's world, where we see fires, and we're seeing bleaching, and we're seeing hurricanes, and we're seeing drought, and we're seeing floods all over the place. As we're recording this, unfortunately, Florida is getting parts of Florida is getting pelted by hurricanes, and this gives us a little bit of hope. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely like a bright spot article. I mean, you can imagine someone at Manga Bay talking to their team, being like, "We need to put out some good news. Try and find any good news." Related to corals specifically. I think with all the bleaching events that's been going on in the Caribbean and off the southeast coast of the U.S. I think, to your point, I'd be curious to see what the next steps for this type of research are. It seems like it was a kind of a remote monitoring preliminary, just sort of like, let's see how the corals are doing after these subsequent bleaching events.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to see not just what the species composition of the coral are like, if those have changed at all during the bleaching events, but also the community around it.
Mm-hmm.
whether it's plankton or fish, if those bleaching events have had any impact on the surrounding ecosystem as well. Because yeah, like you said, they in the article they mentioned it could be one of three different potential reasons, and at this point they can't rule any of them out. It could be that more sensitive coral species in those regions have died off from the
Yeah.
bleaching, and just hardier ones have come back or have taken their place. So some sort of community change. It could be, early signs of natural selection. As corals reproduce, you're just getting more and more tolerant genes, or genes that select for tolerance. Or it could be that they're actually adapting within their life cycle. So, it seems like they're almost sort of describing it as like a vaccine. Like you get a
Yeah.
small bleaching event or a small thermal stress, and for some corals, that's enough to help them withstand larger stresses down the road later in life. So, um, I would imagine it's probably a combination of a lot
Mm.
of things, but sort of seeing what those next steps are like, and if something similar has been done in other parts of the world, looking at bleaching in other regions would be really interesting. Especially as more and more organizations and people look into things like coral transplants. As
Yeah.
you're as these bleaching events are going to become a lot more frequent, temperatures are rising. If there's a way to sort of farm coral and transplant it into sensitive areas, where we know that those corals can be a little bit hardier to these stresses, it's. I feel like the idea of like farming and transplanting is kind of touchy to some people, but we're kind of in that phase with corals. Like we need to
100%.
try everything, and
Yeah.
um, I think one of those organizations actually just a few years ago won a really large grant to continue this sort of research. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. We, a couple of years ago, not this past Ocean's Day, but the year before, I interviewed a PhD student, and her name escapes me unfortunately right now. But she was on the podcast where she was talking about her thesis was to talk about the transplanting. It was at University of Miami, the residential school, and she was actually transplanting. But what they would do is they would condition the corals to different heat tolerances or different heat levels, and then they would see which ones were tolerant, and then what they would do is the ones that were tolerant, those are the ones that they would transplant into the ocean, so that they're ready for a, say, a 1/2 degree, maybe 2 degree difference in temperature, and so that they can handle the 30 degrees Celsius temperature, 31 degrees Celsius temperature, and so forth. So obviously they're in the early stages of that, but I do agree. Although it's very localized with when you do transplants, this research can be replicable, and duplicated in other areas, which is really, I think, is going to be really important for South Pacific, for the Keys, for the Caribbean, for a lot of places, and hopefully a lot of those corals can be tolerated, or can tolerate some of that heat difference, if they're already predisposed to it, and with fragging now, it's pretty much down to a, no pun intended, but science, where people are like, yeah, we figured this out. We can do this in a lab setting. Can that transfer over into a wild setting, with all the variations and variables of the ocean? Maybe some pollution, maybe a different light tolerances as well, and so forth. So there's still a lot of research to go through there. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are working quite hard and quite quickly to see what they can accomplish with that. But I do think that field of transplanting corals is growing immensely, and even the different ways of fragging is growing immensely. And I think that's going to be something that is going to take us into the future, and help save these corals. The other thing I'd like to see in terms of like turning on our science brain here, as you were mentioning, is I'd love to see what genes are actually predisposed to heat tolerance. If it is a genetic variation, I feel like that should be the next step to discover, like those two questions that they asked, and looking at, is it natural selection? What are those genes that have the best heat tolerance? And then can you replicate those? Obviously, you want to maintain a good genetic diversity within a colony, but if you can continue that happening, I mean, at some point we got to make a decision. Do you want corals or no corals in certain areas?
Yeah.
So It's a very tough, road ahead. And so anything we can do, I think, is great. But there seems, and you kind of mentioned too, there seems to be a lot more of these organizations popping up where they're doing transplanting, right? Is that what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's either that there's a lot more organizations popping up, or you're just hearing more about them.
Mm,
Um, I mean, it seems like the idea and practice, to your point, because it's gotten the technology has gotten better,
yeah.
and I think the need for it has gotten more urgent. And so um, I know that the excitement around it, or I guess the popularity of this type of solution, is becoming more and is increasing for sure.
Yeah.
Um, I think a lot more people are starting, hopefully, to realize that it doesn't replace traditional conservation,
Absolutely.
or protection and things like pollution reduction, point source and non-point source reduction, establishing marine protected areas. Like all of those things still are necessary, but I think what it does is it provides a new tool for us, in the
Hmm.
toolbox. And I think people, especially in the funding community, are starting to see the benefits of that tool in the toolbox and starting to
Yeah.
sort of explore, okay, well, where can we apply it?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Being proactive and conserving is much better than being reactive and much cheaper if we really look at it.
Yeah.
Fragging and all this transplanting is expensive. Anytime you're trying to
Oh yeah.
rehab a habitat, it's expensive. It's really really expensive. I remember working with fisheries and oceans, and we were doing something. We were trying to put a new habitat or create a new habitat, revitalize a habitat in I think it was like Lake St. Clair. The amount just to get
Hmm.
rocks in, it was like 200,000-300,000 just for the rocks. And you're just like, it's just rocks, but you had to bring them from somewhere else, and you had to put them in, and it costs money, and people charge, and you're just like, this shouldn't be this expensive. What if they were just there in the first place, but they got dredged out? And so you're like, but way back in the day, and you're like, okay, so now we have to pay for this. So if we had protected it in the first place, we would have saved, at least $300,000. So, and that's, I know some people are like, well, that's not that expensive, but when you talk about conservation work, that's really expensive. That eats up a lot of your budget. And Nate knows, because Nate does grant writing, and he knows how important every dollar is to a project. So coming out and being proactive is a lot cheaper and a lot more effective in the long run than having to revitalize a habitat. So anyway, good article. It was a fun article to chat about, and seeing that this is really nice. I should also mention that Emily Darling, Dr. Emily Darling, was quoted in this article, who works for Wildlife Conservation Society. She's from Toronto. I just wanted to shout that out. She's great. She knows her corals so well, and she was quoted here as saying, "This study is important because for one of the first times, it's comparing the impact of repeated mass bleaching events on corals, and it has a really nice data set for both underwater monitoring. So what is actually happening for the corals in cold water, and then comparing that to what is actually happening with the bleaching environment, both the temperature as well as the light, which we know are two key stressors for corals." So great quote, and we love hearing from Emily Darling. So that's always great to hear from her. So so let's go on to the next story, which was the wind farm and its effect and impact on sea life.
Yeah, this one's from IFL Science, and it's just sort of a primer almost on the potential benefits and harms that offshore wind farms can have on local wildlife, both marine wildlife, and then a lot of seabirds and shorebirds as well. So it gets into, I mean, I think the negatives, the potential negative impacts it has are kind of well known. It can disrupt a lot of the acoustics underwater, which sound is just so important for marine
Mm-hmm.
life that it's hard to sort of predict what direct impacts it has. If it's in whale corridors, that's a real implication that I think most people at this point sort of understand. Like,
Yeah.
try not to put wind farms in important migratory corridors. But then there's other things as well. We're seeing studies of fish being disrupted, whether it's behaviorally, or reproductively from changes in acoustics or noise disturbances underwater. They, the famous criticism, aside from just wind farms looking bad to some people, is that they
Mm.
can disrupt bird migration as well and impact bird population. So it discusses that too. Um, it also goes into some of the benefits. So, despite the need for renewable energy, which I don't think we should gloss over as perhaps the immediate benefit, it also, in some cases, has served as almost an artificial reef for marine
Mm-hmm.
life. So it can help provide suitable habitat for fish and crustaceans and other species. And so, the article doesn't take a stance one way or the other. It's just sort of outlining the research we know now,
Mm-hmm.
the opportunities for further research. They specifically discussed a study that showed a few seals um, sort of congregating around these artificial reef areas that were caused by offshore wind farms. But they also mentioned it was only a handful of seals. We need to do a whole lot more research to figure out the overall impacts that this may have on that particular population. But I mean, I'm curious to your stance. My stance on wind farms these days is we need a lot more of them.
Mm-hmm.
So the takeaway for me from this article is, again, we need more clean energy. We need to get off fossils. So building more wind farms should be a priority. But as we do that, we need to put in place policies, guidelines, practices to make sure that we don't do that at the expense of biodiversity, of marine ecosystem health, because there are ways to get both. There
Mm-hmm.
are ways to ensure minimal harm from offshore wind farms while providing the maximum benefit. And it just needs to be something that we plan for. And so
Yeah.
while there's some cases where we need to just sort of ramp up the building process and the permitting and siting and everything that goes with it, there's also opportunities to sort of insert protections for areas that we know should be off limits, should be
Mm-hmm.
handled sensitively. And we don't need to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater at this point. We can still create a scenario where we can have both the positives for biodiversity of doing it responsibly and the positives for clean energy and the climate of having that renewable energy.
Yeah, I think when people look at it that may not have some experience in science or even conservation, they may see this article and almost take that stance of either we need wind farms or we don't need wind farms. If it impacts sea life, we should throw it all away, or if it doesn't impact sea life, we should go forward. And that's really not the case in this. This is what I worry about, that people take stances. But when you've been involved in the field and you've been involved in these kinds of things, I worked for an environmental consulting firm before, and on wind energy programs. And what I always find is this is still fairly new in terms of energy. Windmills have been around for a long time, but the ramping up of at this scale that we're looking at and that we've been putting in, especially in the U.S., has really been ramping up offshore. It's never going to be perfect. Mistakes probably will be made, but the need for renewable energies at this point outweighs, some of the costs, I should say, in what happens. Now, with that said, I also think that we should learn and use like an adaptive management approach, meaning that, okay, we learn from one installation. And then what happened during that installation? What can we get out of this? How can we do better? Like you mentioned before, don't put it in a whale corridor. Don't put it in a wind corridor where there's going to be mass seagrass migrations. And that will be up to the government or the body that's in charge, whether it's a council or whether it's a specific state or government agency or both. That will be up to them to set those rules and adapt the policy to ensure that it includes those safe havens. I got a GIS brain. So as you were mentioning the corridors and the seabirds and all that, for me, it's like I'm just seeing these layers of data go on top and then trying to find the best zone to put these windmills so that they don't interrupt with that. I mean, you look on the East Coast, you've got a very endangered population of northern right whales. And so that's going to take precedence in a lot of these places. And I assume, hopefully, that the that the windmills are not in that corridor. And we know where those whales are. I mean, they're shifting because of climate change, but we know where those whales go. We know the shipping lanes. We know what those corridors are because we have data on it from decades. Now it's a matter of taking that data and being like, okay, this is where we put that wind farm. But I also think too that some of the companies that have windmills or that are trying to install windmills, they will take advantage of the system if they can, because for them, it's all about the dollar, right? It's all about how much money they can make. And so the government, as well as the consulting firms that work with the company and the government to put these in, have to hold them accountable and have to make sure that they are following the regulations right. As an example, when I worked for the consulting firm, when we dealt with one of those projects, it was more on land. So it was in Ontario, and there's a sort of like a wind corridor within Ontario, like central eastern Ontario. It's a hugely important aspect for migratory birds. And so but it's also, that's a great place to put up windmills because there's a lot of wind. And so, the company came in, we did all the study on birds, this is what's going to happen. Like, here's the risk, and this is what we're going to mitigate for that risk and all this kind of stuff. And then the Ontario government came out, Natural Resources, and said, well, what about bats? And like, what about bats? Well, we've seen research saying that bats can be affected, can be killed by these windmills. Have you done your research? And they're like, no, it's not up to us. It's up to you guys to tell us what it is. And they're like, nope, we're not taking that stance anymore. And they used to take that stance. They used to say it's on the government position to take that stand, to say we need to provide the data. If we don't, that's not up to the companies. But at this point, they were like, no, it's up to the companies. The company has to do that. And so the company had to do it. They employed us to do it. And we did this like phenomenal bat study. I wasn't involved in it because I didn't know anything about bats, but we got new instrumentation and we got all this kind of like monitoring equipment and all this kind of stuff we ordered from Europe and stuff. And it was a great study. And we learned, the offsets that we need to put to make sure that these windmills are not going to affect, these bats, which ended up being, you had to have a certain offset from wetlands, and because that's where they were hanging out. And so like, it's up to the governments to really put the onus on the company to prove that they are not going to disturb certain animals, right, and certain sea life. And that's what the government's supposed to do. Now we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. So you're looking at sea turtles, you're looking at northern right whales, you're looking at any kind of marine mammal that's including seals and sea lions on the West Coast. So that will all come into play. It's a matter of, will the government apply it to that? That's where the key figure is how important how much of a priority are windmills to go in? Will that take priority over the sea life? And I think that's where that line has to be set, and a precedent has to be set. So those are my thoughts on it. What do you think?
I completely agree. I mean, I think there's a real there's a real sort of deep conversation to be had within the conservation side, ocean policy side, energy side sectors. Particularly in the U.S. With the Inflation Reduction Act passing last year, there's so many tax incentives now for a lot of climate solutions, a lot of renewable energy projects. There's definitely some bad stuff in there too. But a lot of the conversation now that I've heard on the climate side is, how do we balance sort of building the good stuff, building the renewable energy and all the infrastructure that's going to need, because it's a lot. And it's a daunting task. How do we balance building all of that with also preventing negative impacts to the extent we can? I mean, there's certainly people in the energy sector and even in the conservation sector who at this point have the view of climate and clean energy takes precedence over biodiversity. The climate crisis is so urgent that if we need to build offshore wind farms, for example, we just can't afford to worry about the ecosystem impacts if that's going to hold up the development of these projects. And there's also people who feel the opposite, feel so strongly that biodiversity needs to be protected, even if that means not building out some of the climate and clean work that we need to do. So I don't think there's a real agreement. I mean, it sounds great to sort of talk about a happy medium and a compromise. And I personally still think that's achievable, but Um, it would almost be, I mean, I would love to see some sort of uh, regulation or guidance from the government, especially when subsidies come into play, that sort of looks at like a scoring mechanism that says,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you want to build this offshore wind farm, you have to do an environmental impact assessment, so we know what those impacts probably will be, or we have a rough estimation of what they will be, and you can get, the amount of your subsidy, the amount of your support from the government will depend on what those impacts are. And we're seeing this with some other technologies too. There's a lot of hydrogen tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, but the biggest subsidies, the biggest financial support for that is only for clean energy hydrogen. So hydrogen that's just from renewable sources. If it's hydrogen from a mix of some renewable, some fossil fuel sources, you can still get subsidized, but it's to a less degree, to a less amount.
Hmm.
So some sort of guidance like that, which granted would be hard to get everyone come to the table and agree on something like that, but making more money available for groups that are able to build these projects with minimal impacts, I think will provide some sort of financial incentive for that balance.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Windmills are always interesting in that we need more renewable energy. Wind energy is quite controversial. Like when you look at it online, there's people who are taking a lot of different stances. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and so I think a lot of the communication has to come out in terms of like what the benefits, as well as looking at an article just like IFL Science put together. It's kind of not taking a stance, but showing the benefits and the advantages and disadvantages, right? And so looking at benefits and costs can really put it into perspective, but at a bit of a more of a balance. And I think we need to really, nothing's going to be perfect, but we have to say what's priority and where do we need it. The frustrating part of all this, though, is the fact that if we had done this like 30, 40 years ago, we could have taken our time and we could have maybe, now we don't really have the time. So the priority is more on renewable energies. But back then we could have taken the time and said, hold on a second here. Let's try and do both, let's learn from our mistakes, and we wouldn't be in this situation now. But hindsight's 2020, I guess, but this is the frustrating part for us, right? Where it's like, we could have done this properly when we told you to do it, but you decided not to do it because you didn't believe it. So that's the frustrating part of all this. Anyway, great article. That was, thanks for the summary. Appreciate it. That was always fun. Now, this one's not necessarily an article. I want to kind of talk about this because I want to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, climate is top of mind for a lot of people. And the climate activism has been around for a long time. 30, 40 years that I've seen it. Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd and a lot of organizations have been, Environmental Defense Fund and so forth, have been out there campaigning, but that hasn't been as, I should say, aggressive, it seems, as it is now, like really in your face kind of protesting. And over the last couple of years, we've really seen an increase. And really, I feel the activism really ramped up with the entire, like, sort of Greta Thunberg, as well as other activists that pretty much ran a worldwide campaign, or were famous worldwide to run campaigns that, was the Friday climate strikes, and, where kids would walk out of school on Friday and walk to, heads of government to protest, the lack of movement or the lack of action with climate change. And then since then, it's kind of increased and increased and increased, and we've really seen it. And there are organizations now that are very popular. Some like popular, I wouldn't say for good reasons, for a lot of bad reasons in people's eyes. They've had a lot of negative press, but they definitely got their name out there. Just Stop Oil, I believe, is one in the UK that has been known for splashing paint on famous paintings. Not ruining them, but definitely splashing them. I think one was on a, what was the name of the painting? I forget, but it was in the Louvre. And so, yeah, like, that caused a lot of anger. Now the organization then the organization turned to protesting in the streets, slowing down traffic, to say, hey, you should stop being in traffic, and getting the government's attention, saying the UK government's attention, saying you need to stop, approving and running and implementing these fossil fuel projects. And then, we've seen some pretty radical ones recently. I saw Just Stop Oil protest that was on an F1 race, like an active F1 race. They went on the racetrack and they sat down and they protested. Got removed right away, but someone could have been killed. Like literally could have been killed by one of those. I would not want to run into one of those when it's going full speed. Some went by them and they had to slow down, but it could have killed somebody else too, like with one of those drivers, which is very dangerous. And then there was another one recently I saw in Nevada by Burning Man. I guess Burning Man's a festival, Nate. Is that what it is?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
music festival.
Is this a music festival? Okay, so it's a music festival, very popular. And so they were protesting, I guess, according to what the video that I saw, they were protesting the amount of private planes that would come in, and all the people who were driving there. So they blocked off the one road into Burning Man, it seems, and caused a mile long, maybe more, lineup for hours where they just blocked the road. Now that turned into a pretty violent protest because a ranger, like a police officer, took it upon himself after I believe it was hours of protest, and people were running out of water, people were running out of fuel. I guess he kind of lost a little bit and lost his patience, I should say, and took his pickup truck and ran through the barricade, almost hitting people, and then turned around again and said, "You better move." And then he did it again to move the barricade out of the way where people could finally go through. Arrested the people fairly, I'm gonna say forcibly, maybe a little bit violently, causing a big uproar, and that video to go viral. So we're seeing just like these protests getting more and more daring. And for me, I feel like I would not want to protest anything that could get me killed. Nate, what are your thoughts on all these protests? Like, do you think they're effective, or do you think it's something that is just more for the press to get people angry?
Yeah, I don't honestly know if they're effective. I mean, we're talking about it, so that's part of it. I think the publicity is a big measure of how effective it is. I think they're getting more and more extreme because people are getting more and more desperate. If your house was on fire or you start smelling smoke, you might at first be like, "Hey guys, we all need to get out of the house." At a certain point, you're going to start dragging people out of the house, or getting yourself out by whatever means necessary. And I think there's a lot of people who have been fighting the climate fight for decades, and they are feeling more and more desperate and more helpless, and they're taking to extreme actions. I mean, I think the F1 example that you mentioned, like, to me, that also sounds incredibly dangerous, because whether or not you're going to get yourself killed, you are putting the drivers at risk, having to swerve and avoid you, and anyone else who is there, you're putting them in danger. So I sort of see that as a little bit different than the Burning Man and some of the art protests that we've seen. Speaking of which, I probably should clarify, I don't think Burning Man is actually a music festival. I Wikipedia'd it while you were talking. It's like a festival on art and community, and
right,
all of these things that I don't know about. But my friends who went to Burning Man would probably hear that and be like, "It's absolutely not a music festival."
Okay.
But I think the desperation is real. And I think, in my experience, again, just living in the US the last few years, protests seem to be being met with more and more hostility from people in power. I think it's hard to sort of look at protests. It's hard to take any elected official seriously who, responds to a protest by increasing the hostility, by ramping things up, by, instead of lowering the temperature, by making the temperature hotter. I mean, we saw this obviously with Trump, not the best example because he's unhinged, but
yeah,
even with the police officer in the video from Burning Man, I think it's I can't imagine what it would have been like to have to do that job. Like you said, there have been people waiting in their cars backed up because of the traffic. They're in the desert. They might have been low on water or other things. It might have been really important for them to be able to get to some um, some sort of resources or
Mm-hmm.
assistance, whatever. But the idea that you are going to meet protesters who are blocking traffic by driving through their barricade, and then it seemed like he was holding out a gun. I'm not sure
He
from the
did.
video
He
if it was
did.
a gun or
He
like pepper
did to.
spray or
Yeah. No, it was a gun to get them on the ground. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that to me just seems like a unnecessary escalation of force.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think there's two things when I hear about these protests. On the one hand, I personally may not endorse like getting attention this way,
Right.
but I also think, especially in the US, we are not doing nearly enough to solve this climate crisis. And I think there's a reason you see a lot of these protesters are younger people because they feel like the older people in power are just like, well, I'm not going to be around for this, so I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
Um, and not quite frankly, not doing their jobs, um, not standing up to fossil fuel interests, which might as well be like another branch of government in the US at this point with all the power they hold.
Yeah.
Even the Biden administration that has talked a big talk on climate and done some really important, great things for the climate fight, have also done some really egregious fossil fuel giveaways that, if you were to sort of take a scorecard or a report card for the Biden administration, it would probably come out to a neutral thing. There have been some wins and there have been some big losses. So the fact that someone who messaged themselves as a climate leader is neutral is pretty bad. So I
Yeah.
think on the one hand, it's the situation is desperate. Um, I can understand how some people facing that desperation would take to these extreme forms of protests. And I also think the reaction they are being met with, which in my head is increased hostility and not even listening to what they really want. I mean, in all of these stories, you hear about, somebody saying, well, there was a disturbance, law enforcement responded as urgently as possible. Not once has anybody been like, but they actually have a point, and like
Yeah.
we will hear them out once we remove them from traffic or get them off the raceway. Like that has never been a part of these stories, and that seems completely ridiculous to me. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I'm frustrated. Clearly, I think you read these things and you're like, well, it's a bit extreme, but like, what else are we supposed to do?
I think that's from the protester standpoint. I think that's what it is. There's that, there's this, and I don't know how they categorize it, but there's this climate anxiety that a lot of younger people feel. And I'm about to turn 45. I feel it. I have two kids that are teenagers, and I look at them and I'm like, what's their life going to be? If this is what life is like now, what's their life going to be in the future? I always look at that. And so you get some anxiety from that as a parent, but I can just imagine as someone like a young person, either a teenager or, early 20s, mid 20s, in their 20s, and say, where's my life now? What's it going to be like? Where can I live? Where can I, things are expensive. That's one thing. But then like, Canada, we have 1,000 wildfires, literally 1,000. Like that's insane. And so where are you supposed to live at that point? How are you supposed to get out of those wildfires if that happens? I mean, the people of Maui, like there's reason to be worried. And so I understand it from a protester standpoint where they're just like, we don't know what else to do. And and there are different messages coming out depending on where you look, where it's like, oh no, it's on the people to do something. And it's really on the governments to do something, which is the biggest changes that need to be done. And so protesting gets the government's attention. There's no doubt about that. I look at how like to evaluate a protest. How do you evaluate it based on were things changed afterwards, or are things going to change because of it? It's a bit of like taking like what they're doing is a bit of like taking a road hostage, but you're basically getting the people who are going. Here's my problem with just the issues I see, not necessarily my problem, but the issues that I see with like protesting in front of a roadway during rush hour. People are trying to get to work. If they're late to work, they could be fired. They could lose their jobs. These are the people who are, some people are struggling to get by, you know, probably a lot of middle-class people, you know, all types of people go to work, obviously, but you're kind of getting the low person on the totem pole when you should be really protesting governments, you know, and I think that is where that's where the biggest effectiveness, like how do you disrupt governments? But I guess, and I'm just assuming that you are working to protest to get people angry to contact their government. I wonder if that actually happens though, you know, because I think people are just like I've seen the videos on the roads where people are getting angry at the protesters, literally pushing them or dragging them out of the way. Some people are just even running through the protest sort of, you know, barricades of people. And so people are just angry at them. They're not necessarily going to shout at the government. I would love to hear or see the data behind like how many officials, elected officials, are getting contacted by people who are saying, you need to make these protests stop, give them what they want. You know, let's stop fossil fuels. That's sort of where I see it. Like, how effective is the protest of blocking a road, getting a lot of people angry, but are you really affecting government at that point? You know, is it really stopping what they want to do? And as a case, you know, a lot of people look at in the UK the Don't Stop Oil. I think there's Extinction Rebellion, I think is the other organization. They're a little bit related, but they're separate. But I think they collaborate on a lot of things. The biggest criticism now for them was that the UK I think they just approved like 120 new oil and gas projects. You know, going almost like it was the opposite effect, it seems. Not sure if they were related or not, but it definitely didn't stop the UK government. So you're like, how effective are these protests other than, you know, just getting the public, you know, pissed off and not necessarily affecting government decisions? I can understand if you're affecting government decisions. That makes sense, you know, but it seems like the more, I don't know if that's why they're going, you know, more daring to start getting more people's attention. But I just think now people are looking at it being like, I don't know, man, this is getting a little out of hand. You know, somebody's going to get hurt, you know, either the protester or like I said, the F1 racer could have been hurt. A car could have gone off, you know, like we've seen those crashes. You know, I don't think any F1 racer wants to hit anybody. There's no way. And so they're going to avoid it at all costs. And then their safety can be a concern as well. So that is one thing that I don't like. And I'd like to see that stop. But I bet you the security probably didn't think that was going to ever happen, because who would do that? That's a pretty crazy thing. And so I would like to see protests that have been effective, you know, and seeing that. I think, like, I know Greenpeace used to, you know, let signs down on government buildings or UN buildings, you know, like that, to say stop oil or stop this and stop that. I feel that's more effective because government officials are seeing that, you know, and they're affecting government business. They're not affecting the regular person business, you know, people trying to get to work in the morning or trying to get home in the afternoon, that kind of stuff. That's how I feel about it anyway.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I don't think, I also would be really curious to see if any sort of data like that exists, or like, you know, what are kind of the rules of the road for an effective protest, basically.
Yeah.
I'm hesitant to ever tell somebody how to protest, short of the safety component. But I think, you know, so I'm not going to sort of say they should have done it differently, but I think to your point, like if their outcome is to affect government policy, then it'd be interesting to see if this, you know, how this plays into that broader strategy.
Yeah.
You know, I think this could be the cynical US citizen part of me, but like, I think we're sort of past the point of recognizing that a few thousand people can sway something as big as climate policy in the US.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's absolutely a role for movements. I think it needs to be really large and very vocal. And also it needs to come with targeted federal government advocacy, targeted directly at the specific decision makers. So like, for example, not just Congress, which Congress members are you targeting and why? You know, I like a lot of policy, at least in the US, is just passed partially because of pressure from constituents on really key members of Congress,
Hmm.
but also because of like backroom deals
Yeah.
and whether or not um, businesses or industry have a heavy lobbying presence. You know, if
Yeah.
they're really mobilized against something, sometimes it doesn't matter how many constituents call in to a certain office.
Yeah.
It sounds really negative, but I think in my experience, that's been true more often than not. So
Yeah.
something like a protest, I think, could be really effective if that is part of the awareness, media, outreach type of component. And then there needs to be, again, if the goal indeed is to sway government policy, then there needs to be some way to sort of harness that energy and say, okay, call your elected official, but call this elected official between these hours, leading up to this vote. And then, while you do that, we are going to simultaneously sort of try and undercut the fossil fuel lobby, to sort of publicly shame them or something, so that not only is the targeted decision maker getting pressure to do the right thing from the constituents that they're responsible for, but if they don't do the right thing, they don't have any political cover. Like we
Yeah.
can shame them in the media, we can call them out. Everybody knows why they didn't do the right thing, and they might not get reelected. So like there
Yeah.
needs to be sort of that compromise. And there's a lot of people who are so talented at this,
Yep.
that you'd like to think this is sort of part of a larger plan, on the climate side. But to your
Hmm.
point, like you never know.
You never
It's
know.
hard to sort of see from our perspective.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. We're making a lot of assumptions here as well. I should mention, and seeing it just from what we see it. I mean, that's what Ocean Talk is all about, and we try and share it with like some of our experience. And one of the things that I have seen, which I find interesting, and this could just be an evolution of an organization, but we've definitely seen like Greenpeace from when it first started was very activist focused, and the people involved were more about the protest than anything else. I mean, it was co-founded by Paul Watson, so that makes sense. He left because it wasn't activism enough, but they were still activists all the way through the 90s, and in the 2000s they really started to change, more policy driven. I find a lot of the people who are working are working to lobby government, are working with government officials to sort of support bills that are very environmental focused and so forth, and the treaties and everything like that. So that happened. I remember when that happened, people from Sea Shepherd said, "Oh, well, Greenpeace went soft." That was the big rivalry before, right? Because of the Paul Watson connection. But now we're starting to see, as Paul Watson got kicked out of Sea Shepherd, we're starting to see Sea Shepherd go more policy focused, a little bit more. And so I don't know if it's an evolution of an organization, that they start to go more policy, or is it more of we find this more effective when we get into larger bills or policy that is more effective. I think it's an interesting look, and I'd love to talk to the people who sort of did that change and why they did that change, to go more policy driven and more, I guess, from a lobbyist standpoint, which is still activism in my opinion, just a different form, and it's just more like targeted. So I'm interested. I
Yeah.
actually am interviewing a representative from Just Stop Oil on Friday, and it's going to be a really interesting interview because I have all these questions, and seeing the effectiveness of these protests and how they're controlled and for safety and everything like that. I think it'll be very interesting. But I just find that evolution of organization interesting, and maybe that's sort of the natural evolution.
Yeah, and I mean the last thing I'll say is I think it's important to also note that likely none of these organizations are operating operating in isolation. So
Right.
there's
Right.
a very good chance that every organization has its strengths. Like to your point, Sea Shepherd and Greenpeace, have the reputation of being more activist or a bit
Mm-hmm.
extreme, and that's what people come to expect from them. That's what, over a lot of their history, that's what they've been good at.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at Oceana specialized in the policy side of it. So we wouldn't do, protests weren't our thing. Sort of mass communications wasn't really our thing. We had some expertise in it, but there's other groups that did it better. With Earth Justice Now, we're litigation and a law
Yeah.
firm on the
Yeah.
environmental side. So that's what we specialize in. And when you sort of take a step back, you realize that a lot of these groups on issues as big as climate change and stopping oil are working together, whether it's directly or indirectly. You know, there's coalitions of groups who are all sort of, you know, Oceana maybe doing the policy side, but then there's another group that might be doing communications. And, you know, sometimes they're working together more closely than other times, but
Mm-hmm.
potentially this could just be one arm of a multi-organizational, multi-group movement. And there's some other groups who really specialize in sort of the government advocacy who are working behind the scenes that we may not hear about. And this is just to sort of draw attention to the issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I think that's really insightful. It'll be interesting to see how all these protests go and see how effective change. I mean, I think we're going to see changes from governments because they have to, just from a management perspective, whether they call it climate change or not, it's going to happen at some point. It just really depends on the government in power, in which state and which at the federal level and at the state level and at the municipal level. And seeing even at the very local level, the mutual friend of ours, Dr. Andrew Thaler, is on a council for climate change in his town, where they talk about adaptation and things like that, moving roads or lifting roads up a little bit. Like it's really interesting, what people can get into. So, but we're definitely going to have to make a change at all levels. So it'll be interesting to see how these protests will either accelerate it or decelerate it, or maybe not have a change at all, but it's just already going to change anyway. So it'll definitely be interesting. But that's it for today's episode. Nate, thank you so much for coming on episode 1500 and sharing your thoughts on these articles, just like we did back in the day. Really appreciate it, and
Absolutely.
love to see you at you bet. Love to see you at Earth Justice and at After Oceana and seeing how your career's done. It's been great to see. And see you grow in this field, and love to have you back on to talk about ocean, just talk about the ocean, do ocean talk again at some point.
Always happy to do it. I mean, I'm really excited to see this podcast and this community take off the way it has, and that's in large part due to you. So, I mean, keep up the amazing work.
Appreciate
excited
that.
For episode 3000, we get another 1500 more.
Man, that'd be awesome. Right on. Well, thank you very much, Nate. Really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Nathan, for joining me on this Ocean Talk Friday and joining us with the audience to share an Ocean Talk on our 1500th episode. This is something that was helped by Nate. He helped me right from the beginning, and it's an honor to have him at our 1500th episode. We will definitely have him on before we hit 3,000. I promise you that. I do intend to hit 3,000 at the very least. And it's going to be another great journey to get another 1,500, maybe more. Who knows where it's going to bring us. But, definitely looking forward to having Nate back earlier than later. It was just a great... it was just a great experience to have him back on. It really brought me back to our times, spending, an hour or two together talking and recording and just hanging out. So it's been a lot of fun. Nate and I were able to meet in person finally at the International Marine Conservation Congress, the first one I went to in 2016, where a lot of people met him. He got to network with a lot of people at the IMCC. It was the first time both of us had really been to an IMCC. I'd been to one prior. I think it was number 2, I believe, in Victoria. But, he got to meet a lot of the people that I had met, and he was just great, in person as he was on Zoom when we used to do him on Zoom. Now we do him on Riverside. But it was just a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it. I really do hope you enjoy it. You can always contact me and let me know what you thought of Ocean Talk Friday, what you thought of the articles, and what you thought of each story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those, and it would be great to hear from you. If you want to hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, that's at How to Protect the Ocean. And again, thank you very much to Nathan Johnson for joining me on today's Ocean Talk. I'm not going to talk anymore because I'm just going to enjoy it. This is episode 1500. This has been a lot of work. It kind of snuck up on me. But I have been watching, but it just kind of snuck up on me in the last couple of weeks. And I'm super excited to be able to bring episode 1500 to you. This is something that is a passion project of mine. I've been able to turn into a bit of a side business, and I look forward to spending more and more time. I always refer to my 9 to 5 job as my side job, and this is my full-time job because I'm so passionate about bringing you this information. And so this is what I love to do, and I look forward to continuing to do it. So I want to thank you so much, like you, the audience who's listening to this, to say, thank you for supporting me throughout this whole ordeal, this wonderful journey. And I appreciate your support in the future. If you think someone would benefit from hearing this episode or any other episode, please feel free to share the show. I would love to hear their feedback of friends and family members who want to know more about the ocean, what they can do to protect it. And if you have any suggestions for any type of show, please let me know. If you want to do an interview on your conservation story, there's a Calendly link in the show notes. And until next time, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.